How do I measure my blood pressure? Now this will be a discussion of how to measure anything and how also I measured things in the past and how I maybe should measure things in the future. Now I want to start by saying that this is how I measured my blood pressure for the last year. Now this gave me a graph actually, and I spent a little bit of time the last days inputting this data that I measured with this blood pressure cuff, which is called the Omron Evolve, and it is a smart blood pressure cuff, which means it inputs its data via Bluetooth into my phone and then into the Omron Connect app. And then if we go into the Omron Connect app, then this here is what it looks like. This is the app. Now, this is already one big downside, and the big downside is that there is no dark mode, even though I prefer a dark mode. Now, if you go into the detailed view, and you also already see that there are two different recommendations. The first recommendation is that you should measure 2 times, and it is in the morning, and you should also measure 2 times in the evening. Now you could also say 2 times, maybe 1 hour before bedtime, maybe after bedtime. Now I actually went to a doctor in the last couple of months, and he told me that if he takes blood pressure from people, then he takes it usually in the morning, if these people happen to be at a hospital, and the people wake up and they still are lying in bed, and then he takes the blood pressure. And that's kind of usually apparently how it's done. And so I try to do this in the morning, the blood pressure measurement in the morning, kind of similar. I stand up and then I measure it almost immediately, because otherwise it might probably change already. And this is already maybe the biggest problem. What if I do anything and then my blood pressure changes? And then if I have a measurement and then it tells me that my blood pressure is too high because, well, maybe it is not the blood pressure that is intended to be measured, which is, one could call it, the resting blood pressure. So now let's maybe think about heart rate. Heart rate is, or also pulse, depending on how you define these two, now is basically how fast your heart beats. Now if I run up a hill, my heart beats faster. And I also have apparently a higher blood pressure if I kind of run up a hill, or at least the equivalent of this, which would be doing a little workout. So I did a little workout and I actually screenshotted what my blood pressure was afterwards. And I did measure my blood pressure on the Galaxy Watch 4, which has the ability to measure blood pressure, which already is then another point to discuss. Should I measure my blood pressure on here or on here? Now, what it actually looked like is 158 to 76 with 116 beats per minute. And this was after a 25 workout, which is 25 push-ups, 25 jumps, and 10 pull-ups, because I still cannot do 25 pull-ups, maybe once a day. Now, if we take a look at this, then it already becomes quite clear that if I would measure my blood pressure, for example, after I worked out every single day, then over time, maybe you would see a trend, but maybe also it was due to the intensity of the workout. And maybe it would not be the blood pressure that everybody talks about, because taking blood pressure seems to be kind of resting blood pressure, but nobody calls it resting blood pressure. Why? Because up until this point in time, continuously measuring blood pressure is a thing that has not really existed. Now there seems to be a company, and this was mentioned by Peter Attia, and I checked them out on the website. The company is actually called Actia, which sounds fairly familiar to Peter Attia, and they make kind of a band which looks a little bit like this. This is the Galaxy Fit 2 by Samsung, but it is kind of a band, that's what I'm trying to say, and it apparently has the ability to measure blood pressure continuously. Now what is continuously? Is it every 10,000th of a second, or is it once a second? Is it once every hour? In the graphs they showed one measurement for every hour, but this also could be an average, because otherwise they would have to display that many values. So I checked them out a little bit on their website. Now this is kind of one point. I want to take this now and combine a few different thoughts I have had in the last weeks actually, and they kind of combined as of the last minutes before this video. Now this is the first point. Now the second point is that I actually had already the ability to measure blood pressure on the Galaxy Active 2. So the watch I had before this, which I don't have anymore because I gifted it to someone else. And I also figured I don't need 2 watches until I realized maybe I do need 2 watches, because if I am disinvested into measuring and this watch gets lost or stolen, then I need kind of a backup. Now, I still don't have a backup, but what I do have now is 2 watches on my 2 wrists. And the second watch I actually then got was a Garmin, but this is kind of now getting off track. Now, first of all, I got the Active 2. Before this, I got the Galaxy Fit 1. Now, as I sold, there was a time when I sold lots of my stuff because I wanted to move and be free and be able to move, so I had to get rid of a little bit. So I also got rid of the Galaxy Fit 1. But later on I would get a Galaxy Fit again because this would be a backup to my Galaxy Watch. If I did not have my Galaxy Watch on me and I still wanted my steps to be tracked, but I do not have my phone in my pocket all the time, then at least I can get my steps tracked, even though other metrics probably are polluted by the less capable sensor on this device compared to this device. Which already brings up another point in these measurements. If I now have the ability, for example, to measure with my Galaxy Watch 4 blood pressure, and I also have the ability to measure it with this here. And also the Omron Connect app has the ability to sync to Google Fit as well as Samsung Health and also to Apple Health, I think. Then what if I now have these 2 different kind of great measurements in one graph? What should I do with this graph? Does it still have anything to say? Or should I maybe have the option to filter out for good quality measurements and for kind of bad or less good quality measurements? And if I don't, what is now the interpretation? If I, for example, go into the doctor's office and I then pull up a graph of, oh, my blood pressure seems to be actually going up, and then I say, oh, well, part of it was measured with this, then maybe this is not the best scenario. But if I say, okay, I measured it with this device, which was recommended by, at least the company was recommended by Dr. Peter Attia, who is an internet doctor or a doctor who makes internet content and seems to be focused on longevity, and he recommended Omron, so I bought a blood pressure cuff from Omron, and this seems to be the most smart or the smartest device from Omron, so that's what I actually did. And then I tried to figure out how often should I measure, and then I measure twice in the morning and twice in the evening. But after some time I realized that twice in the morning and twice in the evening, especially if there's a measurement error every now and then, and especially if I have then my phone also on me, because this only works via Bluetooth and not via Wi-Fi, and have my phone on me at night, then this is kind of a risk because my phone might disrupt already my sleep schedule, because maybe there is something interesting on my phone, and so I might not get to sleep. And if I don't get to sleep, then over time my ability to think and my ability to perform in any level seems to get worse. And so what I'm trying to say here is that maybe if you are at the doctor's office, you want to just say, okay, this is measured by a very good device, compared to, okay, part of it is measured on this device. And so it gets confusing real quick, because if you then have all the data stored in Samsung Health, and Samsung Health does not have a filter for maybe the source of the data, and Samsung Health at least allows other apps to connect to it and to write blood pressure data onto it, similar to Google Fit, compared to Garmin, which does not, then this might be a downside if you are trying to consider Garmin. So now, as I have accumulated, and I do notice that my words sometimes don't make sense. That's because I haven't spoken English in quite a few days and haven't made videos in quite a few days. So now, the first point is that blood pressure seems to change. The second point is, if you now have multiple devices, ideally the devices would be as small as possible, but of course they also should still be good. The measurement should still be good, and not, if I, for example, have a measurement over a year that goes up and up. Now this could be because I have actually changed my sleep schedule. This could be because I've actually aligned my sleep schedule with something else, and in the morning my blood pressure shoots up because I wake up a couple of minutes before, and then maybe this changes over time how this all appears. But maybe if I am trying to get at least the same kind of distance from my sleep in the morning and in the evening, then maybe I do actually have data that over time then looks like this. And this is now Samsung Health. And in this graph, you can actually see that my blood pressure goes up over time. And it actually starts in June 2023, and it has been going up ever since. And somewhat coincidentally, not in June 2023, but already kind of before, I I mean, I do not really know why it went down. It seems to really go down in summer. And this could be maybe because I do less cold exposure in summer. This could be because I did more sauna during this time and I was better heat adapted, because Garmin showed me that there is something like heat adaptation. And so I tried to chase it with doing sauna again and again and again. And this also happens to be when I actually introduced sauna. But I also introduced creatine, like around here, and I also maybe slept worse and better, and maybe worked out a little bit more and less. So overall, I don't have any idea why this could be the case, and any explanation I could come up with is probably wrong. So I've spent a little bit of time in the last days inputting all of my blood pressure data up until this point, at least the one that made sense. And in order to say what makes sense, I have to kind of say what actually I did in terms of blood pressure measurement. So in the past, maybe there have been some measurements by doctors which have been forgotten because you don't get them printed out, and so they are forgotten forever. Now, maybe with the exclusion that if there is something very particular about blood pressure, then maybe it's noted in a medical file, or for example. Now, we actually had a blood pressure monitor at home when I was a child, and so I used this blood pressure monitor as I grew into a teenager, mostly a young adult, every now and then. So from a couple of years ago, I made the point to every now and then take a blood pressure measurement, and everybody laughed at me already. Now, I have this data now, and what I can say with this data is that this seems to be also kind of in the orange zone, in the high normal zone. But I did this mostly in the evening, sometimes in the morning, and I do have the exact points in time. Why do I have these exact points in time? Because even though this was not digital, I took a picture. And the picture has the big benefit that it has a timestamp. And so with the timestamp and the picture, I already back then kind of figured I could then input it into something. And I actually, a couple of years ago, then inputted it into Samsung Health. At this point in time, I think I already used Samsung Health, and I already had kind of some basic data from the Galaxy Fit 2. Now, from this point on, I then had already the Galaxy Fit 2, I then got the Galaxy Active 2, and then after I had it for quite some time, it actually came out that you could measure your blood pressure, I think, with the Galaxy Active 2 already, and also you could measure something else, which was, I think, either the ECG on the Galaxy Active 2, I think it was the ECG probably. ECG and blood pressure. Now, I then switched after quite some time to the Galaxy Watch 4, and this could measure the same thing, but additionally, it could also measure body composition. So now, in terms of body composition, there is something else, and this something else is that I already had a watch. Not a watch, but a scale. Now, this scale has served me since November 2019, so it's been almost 5 years, and it cost $30. Now, I'm mentioning this because I think it also makes sense to discuss kind of the framework on which, or the interval at which it makes sense to measure, and also on which system do you measure, and also how do these systems kind of integrate with each other, and what can you actually interpret or do with all of this data then. Now, if we now take a look at the screenshot from Garmin, then it shows a kind of a very similar picture actually to Samsung Health, but it now has the interpretation. Now, this interpretation again only kind of makes sense if you now assume again that this is resting blood pressure. But now if I just randomly input blood pressure that has been taken during a workout or after a workout, then this graph would be red and red and red. Why would it be red and red and red? Now, the advantage already from going from this to this is that there is some interpretation. Now, one might also see this as a disadvantage because this is just a kind of normal data. But this is already interpreted data, but interpreted data according to the current standards of maybe blood pressure. And the current standards of blood pressure are kind of similar to resting heart rate. If you take resting heart rate of somebody, and now my light switched to red because I have SmartThings set up this way in order to optimize sleep. But conveniently, I do also have a shortcut on my Galaxy Watch with which I can turn it again to circadian lighting. Now, there are two different things here that are going on. The first one is that it shows a range. It shows a range for every given day for the diastolic and the systolic blood pressure. Now, it also shows these interpretation colors. And these interpretation colors are according to the different stages of hypertension. The green one is normal, then the slight orange one is high normal, the orange one is grade 1, the red one is grade 2. But again, this only makes sense if this is resting blood pressure. At least that's my assumption. And this means that I don't really know what this data now means, because I actually left out my evening measurement, and this is what at least Omron Connect tells me in its app that I should do. So 2 measurements in the morning and 2 in the evening. Dr. Peter Attia actually talked about the fact that usually you should wait for 10 to 15 minutes and sit down and do absolutely nothing, and then have it measured once, and then have a certain pause in between, and then measured again, and a pause in between, and measured again. It's similar kind of to resting heart rate. And also usually you also take resting heart rate, I assume at least, or at least my blood pressure cuff takes resting heart rate also. Not really resting heart rate, but the heart rate at which I measure it. And usually that's not my resting heart rate, at least not compared to the resting heart rate that my Galaxy Watch tells me, or Samsung Health tells me, or Garmin tells me, because this is usually maybe 20 points higher, which already has kind of another disadvantage from the classical blood pressure measurement. Now, if you take the classic blood pressure measurement or also resting heart rate measurement, then you are sitting at a doctor's office, and there seems to be this effect that if you are then maybe slightly excited, and excited just in the broadest way, then you are there, and this means your blood pressure might be higher, and also your resting heart rate might be higher, because your systems are working a little bit above what would be resting. And this already is kind of the next thing. Now, that the classical resting heart rate and also maybe the classical blood pressure are just values that have been established in a doctor's office. And maybe they have been taken from studies also, I don't know exactly. But this interpretation is then somewhat not that useful, because if I now have the ability to, for example, measure 10 times a day with my Galaxy Watch and not have this on me all the time, or I measure 25 times because it seems interesting to me what my blood pressure would be if I am out and about and I happen to have jumped into a river that was cold exposure, or I happen to be sitting in a sauna and I want to take my blood pressure there and see what it looks like, then this interpretation is just kind of not useful, because it is made for resting heart rate. Not resting heart rate, but resting blood pressure. Now, I want to kind of discuss the next graph, or the next screenshot rather. And within this next screenshot, we now see my Samsung Health currently. And that's kind of Samsung Health as I now have it. Why do I have Samsung Health like this? Now, the priority of things, or the priority of the cards, says kind of what is prioritized in terms of Samsung Health to me. Now, in the past, I used Samsung Health as the approximation to kind of the platform to manage my health, but that's not really the case, because it's mostly kind of a fitness platform. I cannot input my vaccinations here. I cannot input any actual medical data here. I mostly have this thing that is a little bit of blood pressure. You also have the ability to input glucose monitoring. So I do actually have a glucose monitor, and with this glucose monitor I measure once a week. But what is my measurement once a week? Does this say anything at all? Especially if I then slept a little bit less, or a little bit more, or I ate a little bit later, or a little bit less later, or I don't know. It is just that there are so many variables, and even if I schedule it at the same time every single week, or almost every single day, I'm taking my blood pressure after I wake up, it's minutes apart, because I do stand up minutes later or minutes earlier, and then I do something else, and I then get to measure my blood pressure, and so on and so forth. Which exposes the weakness of a system that only measures 1 point in a week, for example. 1 data point in a week. I mean, what is this? In terms of heart rate, we now have the ability to measure heart rate with something like this, or something like a Garmin, continuously, basically. Now, of course, not infinitely continuously, but maybe just averaging it over a given minute, or taking basically how often it now beats during a given second, and then approximating it or extrapolating it for a given minute, and so on and so forth. So how or why would this not be possible with other metrics? Probably in the future, but which also makes me kind of think that we currently are in kind of the very early stages of wearing basically trackers that can kind of see what our body is actually doing. Now, imagine that you could actually wear a tracker that could measure your glucose, and that's already kind of possible, but it has to be still inserted, and it has to have a connection to your skin, basically, at least, and to something where there is, I think, blood in there, because then it can measure your blood glucose. So there, it is kind of a small thing, and then a needle peaks, or a needle makes its way into your skin, and then the filament gets in there and then can measure blood glucose. And that's called a continuous glucose monitor. Now, these things have been available for quite some time. I think almost for a decade now, if I remember correctly, or maybe 15 years, but they are fairly expensive still. And so, at least for me, it seems to not make sense. I could get maybe one of these devices and then measure it for 14 days, for example, to just get some baseline data, and maybe that would be an experiment. But also, in the long term, I want to have, I mean, how do I then compare it to, okay, the next year, for example? And into kind of the same perspective, not really perspective, but into the same thing, the next topic now goes. And the next topic is that maybe it would make sense to take kind of blood values, blood parameters, or blood, biomarkers, they are also called, and try to interpret these. And this is kind of what has been going on in the doctor's office for quite some time. You can get a multitude of blood markers for lots of different diseases, but also just a baseline blood panel you can also get. And you can also kind of order now, even if you don't know, or if it has not been ordered by a doctor. Now, this is now possible, and the next point then is, how do you interpret this data? And the interpretation of this data is now also kind of getting more and more accessible, with companies such as InsideTracker, with companies such as Heads Up Health, that offer to just interpret this data. Now, you have a value, and this value has a certain range, and this range has been some people have thought about how to interpret this data, and that's basically what a doctor also does. Now, a doctor might have additional things he can then interpret and analyze, and he might also see patterns you don't see. But at least, kind of very basically, you want to have your things organized and all of your medical records, I think, organized in some way or form, and then maybe also your blood panel, and maybe you also have your blood pressure ready, maybe ideally on your phone. So if you are at your doctor's office and there is something that comes up, and you can just pull out your phone, and within seconds ideally, and not with an app that takes 20 seconds to load, such as InsideTracker, then you simply can show your records. Basically, you can show data instead of trying to be nice at the doctor's office, also trying to make it short, such that in 10 minutes you are out of the door again, because that's maybe how long it lasts at the doctor's office, or it should last, because otherwise you are kind of overdrawing your time, and then the 10 other people that are waiting outside are getting angry at you, or maybe the doctor also, because otherwise the people will get angry, and so on and so forth. So what I have been doing is I have been taking a blood draw, and in this blood draw now you can see a few different blood markers, and these blood markers are now stored in the cloud, and I can access them with an app. And this is kind of what they have been looking, or what they look like. Now, what also you are seeing, if I show you my screen, is that my light here is actually kind of very orange. And this is due to the fact that I actually have smart bulbs now that have a circadian lighting, which gets warmer in terms of lighting temperature in the evening, such that it actually seems to improve my sleep score. I don't know specifically if it does improve my sleep score, because how would I be able to track this? Now, in order to track this, I would have to have this as a factor, and then have an objective data measurement, such as this is the sleep score. But then, if I have an objective data measurement, such as my sleep score on a Garmin, for example, then Garmin this morning, for example, just did not get 2 hours of my sleep, similar to the Galaxy Watch. And then, again, how do I even begin? Of course, you can make these data measurements, or measurements in general, and then you can at least have a better insight into how things work compared to not having any. But still, there seems to be some optimizations possible. Now the light turned off because I should actually go to bed. So I've turned the light on again. Now this is kind of the second point, that you can now do this. You can get blood markers. Now all of these blood markers, ideally, maybe a watch like this takes in the future. But at least as of currently, it doesn't. So at least as of currently, you have to do them at a certain interval. And because they are also fairly expensive, so if you take the whole blood panel, InsideTracker, for example, would do, it would cost me, if you did it, I don't know how much it would cost you, maybe a lot more, but it would cost me, I think, 250 or 260 euros. Additionally, I would have to pay the blood panel upload for Inside Tracker, which seems to sell currently at $150, but they sometimes run a discount, sometimes they don't, and so I don't know whether the price they actually are currently showing me is kind of the real price, and I also don't know how much I paid when I bought this a couple of months ago. So currently, the problem is that Garmin Connect has the strategy that either buy our own products, our own blood pressure monitor, or our own scale, or you cannot import any way possible the weight. You also cannot manually import or input body fat. What you can now manually input is blood pressure. So I manually input all of those values. You can also add a note to this. And this seems to be, I think, at least a step into the right direction. So the question is, or remains, whether this is actually then possible in the future to maybe not only input it manually, and I also tried it on web, but on web you cannot even select, you cannot even use number keys to input basically dates, for example. So you have to also select them manually. And this is kind of what it looks like. You can input systolic, diastolic, heart rate, the date, the time, as well as a few notes, and then it stores it in this graph here. And the first graph looks like this. So this is the day, and then you can also switch to the week, and then it shows for all of the days, it shows the range, and then you switch to the 4-week range, and then you switch to the 1-year range. Now, a big benefit of Garmin Connect is that it also has a web platform. And this is one of the main things that also drove me away, to a certain extent at least, from Samsung Health, because it does not have a web platform. And it is no big secret at this point in time that maybe at least I should avoid my phones as much as I can, at least to a certain amount of time. And that's usually the time where I try to get anything done. And that's usually kind of all the time, at least if I think of anything I do as a thing I want to be doing. And that's kind of one of the main problems I think that is existing with Samsung Health, because you just do not have a web platform. Also, if you're sitting there in the doctor's office and you manage to get your notebook out in the couple of minutes that are left until you are out of the door again, and because maybe you have this one medical record you want to show in order to kind of underline what you're trying to say at the doctor's office, for example, then, well, it already would be nice if then also Samsung Health would have a platform where you could also draw or show data. Now, I want to actually say something else. And this something else is that the question of now how to measure is not only a question of what to measure, but also of what and on which platform to measure. So if I take grip strength, for example, I cannot measure it in any platform. This is kind of a dumb device. It kind of shows me something, but I then have to ideally input this value with a timestamp. So I'm currently using a gym tracker called Strong to just input my grip strength. Now, it would be nice, for example, if Garmin would also include grip strength as a metric you could track. Maybe Garmin would even bring out their own grip meter, and then they could make money with this grip meter. Maybe it would make sense if this device here, my blood glucose monitor, would also sync to a certain extent with Garmin. Now, there seems to be a company that actually is somewhat working with Garmin, and this seems to be Dexcom. Now, there also is another company, which I can't remember, which also works with Garmin, but then in Garmin Connect, it seems that you do not have a blood glucose metric similar to Samsung Health. In Samsung Health, if you go actually into it, let's go into Samsung Health, you do have a blood glucose thing here. And this is something that I also have been tracking. So I do take these weekly blood glucose measurements, and then I input it with the right timestamp into Samsung Health. And at least it is now stored in one of the health apps I use, compared to just in the health app that is from this device, which I can't remember the name of. Now, there are also a few other things. This, for example, is the Mir Smart One, and this I got in order to measure my peak expiratory flow. Currently also no connection, and you also cannot input custom metrics into neither Samsung Health nor Garmin Health. Then also, you cannot measure So this is for circumference measurements. If you want to measure your neck or your biceps or your chest or your stomach or your waist to hip ratio, then you need to measure it with a tape usually. There are already kind of smart tapes around. They kind of measure and then you click a button and then it kind of records how much this has been going out, and then basically it stores it digitally also in your phone. Now, this also does not connect to either Samsung Health nor Garmin, and nor can you track any of these metrics, such as circumference, within any of these apps. With with some apps like FitnessPal, you can measure some of these metrics. With actually the Scale app, I could measure some. I basically used the Scale app, the first Scale app. This is another problem because the first Scale app doesn't work with the scale, but it still is kind of the way, or it is the way where I store my circumference measurements. And so, ideally, you would have one platform. Maybe for some people this is actually Apple Health, but I do not have an iPhone, I do not have a Mac, so Apple Health is not an option. Apple Health seems to already have the option to add, I think, vaccinations to it, and to add also, I do not know about vaccinations, but what I heard on, or saw at least, on a video from Shervin Shares is that he already had the ability to input his blood values into Apple Health. And currently I do not have my blood values in Garmin, for example, or in Samsung Health. And also the question is obviously, do you want really your blood values to be stored in Samsung Health or in Google Fit? With then Google also controlling YouTube and so much more. Now, and then ads that are targeted to you and to your hypertension and to basically all the maybe diseases you could have with your profile, with your health profile, or you could have in the future, or then it shows you at this point in time where you probably are likely to develop diabetes type 2, then it shows you all of these different things, but before it shows you all of the cookies that you need to eat. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that I do not know what I should do now. I mean, the current scenario is that what I'm currently doing is when I stand up, I measure my weight and I also measure this. Now, I would also have the ability to measure my body composition with Samsung. In Samsung, then, it shows actually my skeletal muscle mass as well as my absolute fat mass, which would be very nice. And then I could only use this as a dumb scale that only would show me my weight. So I could kind of get rid of the necessity for an additional app with this here, and so there would not be a need to get the index, the Garmin index scale in the near-term future, but I obviously would not have these values in Garmin, and you also at this point in time cannot manually input body fat and muscle mass and so on in Garmin. Now, it also would be nice if in the future I would not need a scale at all, but a scale would still be probably required. Even if you have two watches that can do a lot, you still need to probably stand on something in order to get your weight measured, even though maybe the weight is not the most important thing after all, and it might be muscle mass and total body fat, or absolute body fat rather. So now there would also be an option where I just don't measure it. So what I have to mention is that you have to calibrate the Galaxy Watch. So you still have to have one of these anyway. And if you calibrate it every couple of weeks or every couple of months, then you can measure it. Now the question is obviously, do I want to pollute my data set in Samsung or in Garmin with measurements from here? And also, do I manually want to input all of the measurements into Garmin? If I take like 10 measurements a day, no, I don't want to. But I at least inputted all the measurements at this point in time. Maybe it was just because the beta allowed it. Maybe it was for some other reason. No, that's basically kind of reaching the end, or I am reaching the end here. You have lots of different metrics on this watch already. This is again the 7S Pro from Garmin, and you have, for example, a solar ring, which allows you now to track light exposure. And this has been very informative in the last weeks. And there have been weeks, for example, where I barely got any sun at all, because sometimes it is just cloudy outside, and then there is just a very large difference, a very huge difference, you could also say, in terms of the sun exposure you get with like 2 sunny days in a week, or no sunny days in a week, if you still get out the same kind of days. Also, respiratory rate has been kind of informative. Also, it is very nice that you have the ability to have kind of these hardware buttons on here, and not just 2 buttons like on the Galaxy Watch 4. Now there is already the Galaxy Watch 5, there's already the Galaxy Watch 6, and they also have kind of more hardware buttons on them again. Now, I probably will just keep my current setup with these measurements, and because in the future, I think this watch will be able to measure blood pressure. I mean, this is a watch that is twice as expensive as this watch, even the newer versions of this watch. So Garmin probably is already working on blood pressure and will also maybe bring it out to this watch or also to past watches or maybe onto future watches. If then it does this, I still have a monitor to calibrate the measurements, and so I would not need probably the one from Garmin. And as long as this is still working, I would not need it. And also in terms of future considerations, maybe having a blood pressure monitor for more people, similar to how my parents did this in the past. I mean, if in the future blood pressure measurement, and let's say this is in the next 1 to 10 years, is continuous, then nobody probably will measure blood pressure with this anymore, because similar to heart rate, of course you can still measure your heart rate, but I mean, how much value is there in a single measurement of heart rate or of pulse? Almost none, compared to just having the graph of the entire day, for example, or of the entire year with maximum heart rate, with resting heart rate, and so on and so forth, kind of filtered out. The normal heart rate graph is basically almost, I don't know, it doesn't say a lot, and a single point from this graph also doesn't say a lot. So similar it might be with blood pressure. Similar it also might be with blood glucose. Of course you can measure your blood glucose in the morning. So this again would be resting blood glucose with the body having rested for 8 hours, and then you wake up and then you can measure these things. But during the day, it also might be interesting what it does when you eat a banana. It also might be interesting what it does when you're actually swimming. It also might be interesting when you barely had a bike accident or you barely escaped a bike accident, and what your blood glucose did then. Did it like spike like this, and in which time interval? These would be very interesting graphs, I think, to look at. And in the future, maybe watches like these might be able to measure these. So this, in maybe the next 10 years, will be something I no longer need, or which would be basically worthless, apart from calibrating watches. This here would also probably be for calibrating watches, so maybe it might make the most sense to still, have it. Then, if, for example, the Garmin could in the future also measure body composition and skeletal muscle mass on its own, similar to the body composition feature on the Galaxy Watch, then the only thing you would need would be kind of a very dumb scale. Now, of course, it would be maybe more convenient to just step on the scale in the morning for 5 seconds and then already have it automatically synced via Wi-Fi, which is something that both Garmin devices have. The scale as well as the blood pressure monitor, they have Wi-Fi. I don't know if they also have Bluetooth, but this would be probably a little bit better, because it would at least mean for me that I would not have my phone on, even though I usually now have to have my phone on, because otherwise the circadian lighting with Samsung SmartThings does not work properly. It does not turn off or on, even though I have a smart hub and it also is connected to the internet. There seems to be something that my phone does which cannot be emulated or done by the hub. And then maybe in the future you also have something like this, which probably cannot be measured with a watch like this. But I already track my workouts with my Garmin Fenix. Maybe in the future you would also have a version of this that at least syncs to Garmin Connect, for example, and then Garmin Connect gives you a bigger picture, or Inside Tracker gives you a bigger picture of what your biological age, for example, would be, and it also takes into account this year and how you compare to your peers and your age group. And well, there are already kind of smart urine tracker devices out there, because this is currently also something I do every now and then. This is a urine stripe, and there are already devices that you can put in your toilet. They are still very expensive, and then they kind of get an analysis. I mean, apart from your blood, your urine might be one of the most interesting things to look at, or substances to look at in terms of what your body is actually doing on the inside. And that's kind of all the measurement devices I have at this point in time. This is my measurement box. This is just a red light cap, basically, but that's the insert of the cap in order to prevent hair loss, which is something I copied from Brian Johnson, who also tries to prevent hair loss. I also do have a microneedling pen, but that's in my bathroom. And, well, blood glucose monitor, blood pressure cuff. Then the dynamometer for grip strength, also a very good predictor of, I think, also cognitive decline and things like this, but I cannot remember exactly what, but mostly a predictor for basically strength. Grip strength as a predictor for strength measured with this dynamometer, which you turn on and then you just press it as hard as you can, at least if it already starts. And then you have this, which measures circumference. Maybe in the future you would just have a camera that kind of knows your height, or you have kind of a reference frame behind you or something like this, and then you just say, okay, I'm this tall, and then it measures things out from taking a picture and then taking the proportions, or I don't know, because it still, circumference might be a little bit more difficult to do like this. And then this is a Garmin 6S Pro. This is a Garmin Galaxy Fit, which I use occasionally, but it is just very hard to get it on during the time at which I charge these devices. And so I usually charge these devices and have my steps during this time not tracked, and also no heart rate. And also there's this thing, so I actually have the heart rate turned off. This is now just additional info for no additional benefit. I have turned the heart rate off because I don't want this kind of cheaper sensor to pollute my better sensor pulse rate, because I noticed that this seems to be more kind of off compared to this one, or at least that's my suspicion, and maybe that has been confirmed. Maybe I don't have any idea and should have compared these measurements better and maybe have taken them at the same time. And also this is still a very big thing, but it also gets my body fat. But also, what is body fat? If over time I manage to gain maybe 2 kilograms of muscle, and also I drink a little bit more, I drink a little bit less, but it seems to be very, then what I'm trying to say is that body fat is only proportional to weight. So if you increase by your muscle mass by 10 kilograms, then your body fat can be higher. So your body fat could still be 10%, but your absolute fat amount would still be higher. So maybe the absolute muscle mass would be a better indicator. Just get your muscle mass as high as possible and get your fat mass as low as possible, instead of trying to manage body fat and getting body fat low and asking everybody what his body fat is, even though, well, of course, within the limits of normal people, body fat is still a better predictor, maybe compared to health, not compared to health, compared to weight. Maybe I should just go to bed. And this is my 7S Pro. This is my Galaxy Watch 4, which I will now put on and hope that they will be tracking my sleep.